The deep red velvet curtain before me was heavy, not just with the weight of its fabric, but with the weight of 30 years of waiting. Behind it was the auction hall of the Shanghai International Auction Center, where the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume, aged mahogany, and unconcealed ambition. I stood in the wings, the calloused hands of a lifelong potter clenched tightly, feeling every pulse of blood drumming through my veins. My breath, usually as steady as the turning of a potter's wheel, was now shallow and quick. Beside me, Zhao Ming, my adopted son and only apprentice, was adjusting his tie. In the reflected glow of the stage lights, his face shone with an unfamiliar brilliance. He wore a perfectly tailored suit, his hair slicked back with gel, looking more like a successful young entrepreneur than the heir to the Lin family kiln, which had been stained by 3 generations of smoke and fire. "Father, don't be nervous," he said, his voice as light as a breeze. "Today is your day, our Lin family's day. Eternity will leave the world in awe." He mentioned my work. Eternity. The ceramic vase I had spent the last 10 years of my life perfecting. It was not just clay and glaze, it was my soul, the revival of the legendary lunar white glaze, a glaze created by my ancestors, capable of shifting colors under the moonlight. Tonight, I wasn't just selling an object. I was passing on a legacy, proving that in this fast-paced world, age-old values could still endure. The auctioneer began his introduction. His voice boomed through the speakers, recounting the history of the Lin family kiln, praising my contributions. I heard my name called, and Zhao Ming patted me lightly on the back. "It's time, father." I took a deep breath, the smell of stage dust filling my nostrils, and stepped out. Camera flashes went off like lightning, forcing me to squint. Hundreds of pairs of eyes fixed on me, curious, admiring, and scrutinizing. At the center of the stage, on a black marble pedestal, was eternity, veiled by a white silk cloth. I approached the pedestal, my hands trembling. This was the moment I had dreamt of 1,000 times. The moment a lifetime of labor would be recognized. I glanced at the front row, where the most renowned critics and collectors sat. Their eyes gleamed with anticipation. "Ladies and gentlemen," I began, my voice hoarse with emotion. "Today, I have not brought you an antique. I have brought you a promise. A promise that the art of our ancestors is still alive." I grasped the edge of the silk cloth. The entire hall held its breath. Time seemed to stop. But just as I was about to pull the cloth away, a figure strode out from the wings. It was Zhao Ming. He walked onto the stage, his face no longer radiant but set with a chilling solemnity. He placed his hand on mine, stopping me. A murmur spread through the hall. The auctioneer looked confused. "Mr. Ming, is something wrong?" Zhao Ming didn't answer him. He looked directly at me, but his gaze wasn't for me. It was for the crowd. He took the microphone from the auctioneer's hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice clear and resonant, "I apologize for the interruption. I am Zhao Ming, the adopted son of Master Lin Yong'an. I have studied under him since I was 8, and no one understands him better than I do." He paused, letting the silence hang heavy. My heart began to pound erratically. A sense of dread, like a cold current, seeped into my bones. "I stand here today," he continued, "not to praise, but to speak a painful truth. A truth my foster father has tried to conceal." He turned to me, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a flicker of pain in his eyes, but it was quickly extinguished by an ironclad determination. "The real eternity," he said loudly, pointing at the veiled vase, "is no longer here. It was sold. Secretly sold 3 months ago to a notorious black market collector to pay off massive gambling debts." The hall erupted in shocked whispers. I felt the blood freeze in my veins. Gambling debts? I had never touched a playing card in my life. "And what is on this stage?" Zhao Ming shouted, his voice filled with feigned indignation as he ripped the white silk cloth away, "is merely a replica, an elaborate fraud to deceive all of you." The vase was revealed. It had the same shape, the same glaze color, but to a father's eye I knew something was wrong. It lacked the spirit I had breathed into it. "How can we believe you?" A critic in the front row stood up and yelled. "Here is the proof." Zhao Ming pulled a phone and a stack of papers from his jacket pocket. "This is a recording of my father admitting to selling the vase. And these are bank statements showing a transfer from an overseas account into his personal account, all authenticated by my lawyer." He projected the images onto the large screen behind him. Numbers and characters danced before my eyes. All of it was fabricated. The voice on the recording was mine, but cruelly edited from our daily conversations. The world started to spin. I wanted to scream, to refute it, but my throat was constricted. I looked at Zhao Ming, the child I had taken from an orphanage, whom I had taught how to knead clay, how to turn the wheel, the child to whom I had intended to entrust my entire life's work. He was destroying me, calmly, cruelly. The cameras turned on me, flashes firing relentlessly. I was no longer a revered master. I was a fraud, a criminal. Shouts and curses rose from all around. The honor of 3 generations of the Lin family, more precious than life itself, had turned to dust in a matter of minutes. I stumbled backward, bumping into the pedestal. The fake eternity wobbled, then crashed onto the marble floor, shattering into 100 pieces. The piercing sound was like my own heart breaking. In the chaos, I saw only one thing. Zhao Ming stood there, center stage, bathed in the spotlight, his expression terrifyingly placid. He had won. The velvet curtain had fallen, not to end a performance, but to bury me alive. And the blade that pierced my heart was not wielded by a stranger, but by the very son I loved most. The high-speed train from Shanghai to Jingdezhen took nearly 4 hours, but to me, it felt like a lifetime. I sat huddled by the window, watching the skyscrapers, rice paddies, and small towns glide by like scenes from a silent, meaningless film. My reflection stared back from the glass, a face that had aged a decade in a single night. My eyes were sunken, and the lines around my mouth were etched with bitterness. I had left the auction house like a ghost. No one stopped me, no one said a word. They just looked at me with contempt, pity, and disgust. Zhao Ming didn't look at me. After finishing his performance, he was surrounded by reporters, answering questions with the pained expression of a betrayed son. A perfect actor. I carried nothing but the clothes on my back and a phone with a dead battery. Eternity was broken, as was my life. I didn't know why he had done it. Money? Fame? Or was it some deep-seated resentment I had never noticed, smoldering in his heart for all those years? The questions swirled in my head, unanswered, leaving only a chilling pain. When the train stopped at Jingdezhen station, I stepped onto the platform. The air here was different from Shanghai. It carried the scent of damp clay, the smell of smoke from the kilns, and a solemnity steeped in 1,000 years of history. This was my home, but today, I felt like a stranger. News travels faster than a high-speed train. As I walked the familiar cobblestone path leading to my workshop, I could feel the eyes on me. My neighbors, other potters, they used to greet me with respectful bows. Now, they glanced at me, then turned away, whispering among themselves. Those whispers hurt more than the shouts in Shanghai. They were small blades, slowly cutting into my flesh. The Lin family kiln was at the end of a small alley, nestled under an ancient parasol tree. It was where my grandfather, my father, and I were born and raised. Every brick, every tile was soaked in sweat and memory. But as I approached, my heart clenched. The familiar crimson wood door was sealed with 2 stark white notices, bearing black characters and the red stamp of the authorities. Sealed for investigation. I stood frozen. They had acted so quickly. It must have been Zhao Ming's preparation. He had calculated every step. I raised my hand, wanting to touch the door, but then pulled it back. This house, this kiln, was no longer mine. Master Lin. A frail, aged voice called from behind me. I turned. It was Uncle Zhang, the old craftsman who had worked for my father since he was a boy. He had long since retired, but passed by here every day. His wrinkled face was filled with worry. I heard, he said, his voice faltering. I don't believe it. That boy, Ming, that boy. I just shook my head in silence. What was there to say? To explain that it was all a conspiracy? Who would believe me when the evidence was plastered all over the news? This is your home, Uncle Zhang said, looking at the seal with anger. They have no right. They have every right, Uncle Zhang, I interrupted, my voice dry. When honor is lost, a man has nothing left. I turned and walked away, not daring to look back at my home. I wandered aimlessly through the streets of Jingdezhen. Everything was familiar, yet alien. The tea house where I used to sit with other masters, the glaze shop where I knew every type of mineral powder, the river where I often sat to watch the sunset for inspiration. Now, they all seemed to mock me. Night fell. Red lanterns were lit, casting dim, hazy glows on the damp stone streets. My stomach growled with hunger, but I had no desire to eat. I sat on a stone bench by the river, watching the water flow sluggishly. Ashes from some distant kiln drifted over the water's surface, like fragments of my reputation. I had lost everything. My workshop, my work, my honor, and my son. I was the last of the Lin line, and I had allowed my ancestors' legacy to be defiled. Guilt and helplessness overwhelmed me. Perhaps I should just throw myself into this river, let the water wash away all the shame. But then, the image of my wife, Alan, appeared in my mind. She had passed away early, before I adopted Zhao Ming. Before she died, she held my hand and said, "Yong'an, the clay may break, but the fire in the kiln must never go out. The fire of the Lin family is in your hands." The fire. The fire in my kiln had been extinguished. But what about the fire in my heart? Had it truly died? Number. It couldn't die. Zhao Ming could take everything from me, but he couldn't take these hands. He couldn't take the secrets that ran in my blood. He could destroy Lin Yong'an's reputation, but he could not kill my art. A decision sparked in my mind, clear and powerful. I would not die. I would not fall. I would disappear, just as Zhao Ming wanted. But I would not disappear to escape. I would disappear to return. I stood up, the night's chill seeping into me but unable to quell the newly kindled flame. I would go to a place where no one knew who I was. I would find a new kiln, with my own 2 hands. And I would create another work. A work not for sale, not for display. A work for vindication. A work that would silence the world and make Zhao Ming's lies consume themselves in their own fire. I left the bench and walked into the darkness. I did not look back at Jingdezhen. This city, with its glory and its bitterness, was now in the past. Ahead of me was an unknown path, with only cold ashes and an oath forged in fire. I left Jingdezhen on the earliest bus, a rickety old vehicle filled with farmers taking their produce to the county market. I had no specific destination, only knowing I had to go west, towards the towering mountains and villages that still retained their rustic simplicity. I needed a place to hide, a place where the name Lin Yong'an carried no weight, nor the burden of shame. After 2 days of travel, changing buses several times, I arrived at a small village named Luoshui, nestled deep in a valley. The village was poor, with only a few dozen houses roofed with weathered gray tiles. The air here was pure, carrying the scent of damp earth, plants, and an almost absolute tranquility. People looked at me, a stranger in worn-out city clothes, with curiosity but not judgment. I used the little cash I had left to rent an abandoned house at the end of the village. The house was small, with earthen walls and a thatched roof, but it had one thing that made me choose it without hesitation. Behind the house were the remains of an old kiln. A dragon kiln built against the mountain, the most ancient type. Half of it collapsed and overgrown with weeds, but its basic structure was still there. Looking at it, I felt a strange connection, as if we were both ruins waiting to be reborn. The first days in Luoshui were filled with hard physical labor. I cleaned the house, cleared the overgrown bushes, and began the work of repairing the kiln. I had no professional tools, only a few farm implements bought from the villagers. I rebuilt the collapsed sections of the kiln wall with clay mixed with straw, and I rebuilt the chimney with my own hands. The villagers saw me working diligently from dawn till dusk. They didn't ask many questions. Occasionally, someone would bring me some boiled sweet potatoes or a bowl of thin congee. In particular, there was Mr. Zhang, an old farmer who lived alone next door. He was a man of few words, his face weathered, but his eyes were sharp. He would often sit on his doorstep, smoking his pipe and watching me work. Sometimes, he would quietly bring over a better hoe or some dry wood he had saved. We didn't talk much, just nodded to each other, but I felt an unspoken understanding. After a month, the kiln was basically repaired. It wasn't perfect, looking crooked and old, but it could hold a fire. That was what mattered most. And then, I began to search for clay. In Jingdezhen, I had the best sources of kaolin and feldspar. But here, I had to find it myself. I walked along streams, climbed hillsides, digging, tasting, feeling the earth with all my senses. My hands, the hands of a master potter, were used to fine, pure clay. Now, they had to get used to the coarse, impure earth of the mountains. Finally, I found a vein of reddish-brown clay deep beneath the roots of an ancient tree. It wasn't the best quality, but when I kneaded it in my palm, I felt a latent vitality, a wild stubbornness. I decided to use it. I brought the clay back, built a soaking pit myself, and began the process of manual refining. This work required endless patience. I had to soak the clay, stir it, remove pebbles, and then filter it through layers of coarse cloth to get the finest clay particles. In Jingdezhen, this process was done by professional craftsmen. Here, it was just me. During those months, I barely spoke. I lived in silence. The silence of the mountains, of the empty house, and of my own soul. There was no city noise, no praise or slander. Just me, the clay, and the kiln. In that silence, I began to knead the clay. For the first time since the tragedy, I placed a lump of clay on the potter's wheel. It was an old, foot-powered wheel I had bought. As I kicked the first few rotations, the clay wobbled. My hands still trembled. Memories of that horrific night flooded back Zhao Ming's face, the shouts, the shattered pieces of eternity. The clay on the wheel distorted and collapsed. I failed. The second time, and the third, were the same. The anger and resentment were still too strong within me. They made my hands lose their gentleness, my mind its stillness. The art of pottery does not tolerate a soul in turmoil. I slumped to the ground panting. Perhaps I was wrong. Perhaps the fire within me had truly died. Just then, Mr. Zhang came over. He said nothing, just placed a bowl of hot green tea beside me. The steam rose, carrying a delicate fragrance. He looked at the failed lumps of clay on the floor, then at me. "The clay is like a person," he said in his raspy voice. "When the heart is full of stones, it cannot become round." With that, he turned and left, leaving me alone with his words. When the heart is full of stones, he was right. My heart was still full of the stones of hatred, of pain, of self-blame. I could not create anything from such a soul. I didn't try to make pottery anymore. Instead, every morning I meditated in front of the kiln. I breathed the fresh morning air, listening to the birds sing, the stream flow. I tried to empty my mind of all thoughts, focusing only on the present. I learned to embrace the silence, not as an emptiness, but as a space for healing. Gradually, my mind settled. The pain was still there, but it was no longer boiling. It was like the cold ash at the bottom of the kiln, heavy and subdued. I realized my plan for revenge could not begin with hatred. It had to begin with peace. I could not create a great work from a petty soul. One afternoon, after weeks of just sitting and breathing, I returned to the wheel. I placed a lump of clay on it and began to kick. This time, my hands were steady. The clay began to spin, round and even. Under my touch, it gradually rose, forming a small bowl. Simple, unadorned, but balanced and stable. I had succeeded. It was just a rough bowl, but to me, it was more precious than eternity. It was proof that I was still a potter. The fire within me had not gone out. It was just waiting, in silence, to be rekindled. Life in Luo Shui continued to flow, slowly and steadily like the breath of the earth. I worked ceaselessly, but without haste. My days were a cycle of tranquility, finding clay, refining it, kneading it, and shaping it. I didn't try to create complex pieces, just simple bowls and plates. My goal was not to create products, but to rediscover the lost connection with my hands, with the clay. One afternoon, while in the county town to buy some rice, I happened to see an old newsstand. On the cover of a prestigious business magazine, I was stunned to see Zhao Ming's face. He was dressed in an expensive suit, sitting in a luxurious office, with beautifully displayed ceramic products behind him. The headline read, "Zhao Ming, breathing contemporary soul into the legacy of Lin family ceramics." My heart felt like it was being squeezed. I picked up the magazine with trembling hands. The article praised Zhao Ming as a genius reformer. It recounted the heartbreaking story of how he had to bravely expose his foster father's deceit to protect the family's honor. The article claimed that under his leadership, Lin family ceramics had broken free from its old-fashioned ways, combining traditional techniques with modern design to create products that were both artistically valuable and appealing to the mass market. I flipped through the pages, images of mass-produced tea sets and flower vases. The glaze was shiny but soulless. The patterns were machine-printed, sharp but rigid. They bore the Lin family name, but they had no Lin family soul. They were just empty shells, sold at exorbitant prices thanks to the brand story he had built upon my ruin. The anger I thought had subsided surged in my chest. He hadn't just stolen my workshop. He was distorting, killing my ancestors' legacy. He was turning art into a commodity, a soul into a marketing gimmick. I crumpled the magazine in my hand and threw it into a roadside trash can. But the image of Zhao Ming's smug smile haunted me. His success was built on the ashes of my life, and that I could not accept. That anger, instead of consuming me, became a fire, a driving fire. I realized that making simple bowls and plates was not enough. I had to create something that he, with all his machinery and money, could never replicate. I had to resurrect the lunar white glaze. Returning to Luo Shui, I threw myself into my work like a madman. I began to restudy my ancestors' notes, the yellowed notebooks of mulberry paper I had fortunately brought with me. The secret of the lunar white glaze was not just in the formula, but also in the firing temperature, the type of firewood used, and most importantly, the interaction of trace minerals found only in specific types of clay and water. Here, I didn't have the premium materials of Jingdezhen. I had to find substitutes myself. I roamed the mountains, collecting rock samples, grinding them into powder, experimenting with the ash of different trees. My small hut soon turned into a crude laboratory, with dozens of small bowls containing test glazes. The first firing was a disastrous failure. When I opened the kiln, the test bowls were either cracked or had a glaze the color of dull mud. The kiln I had repaired couldn't maintain a stable temperature. The firewood I gathered burned unevenly. That night, a huge storm hit the village. The wind howled through the cracks in the door, and rain lashed against the roof as if trying to tear it apart. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the valley in flashes of white. I sat in my hut, watching the flickering oil lamp, listening to the fury of nature. The storm outside mirrored the storm within me. I was battling despair, scarcity, and my own past. Zhao Ming was in Shanghai, in a warm penthouse, sipping wine and enjoying his success. And here I was in a dilapidated hut, facing failure in a storm that threatened to sweep everything away. The next morning when the storm passed, the village was battered. A section of my roof was torn off, but the kiln, miraculously, was still standing. Though crooked, it stood firm against the mountainside. Looking at it, I felt a renewed sense of strength. I decided to rebuild the kiln. This time, not just a repair. I would build a new one from scratch, based on the most ancient designs in my ancestors' notes. A kiln that could control airflow and temperature more precisely. Mr. Zhang and a few other villagers, seeing my determination, came to help. They didn't understand what I was doing, but they saw the fire in my eyes. Together, we went into the forest to cut wood, dug refractory clay, and laid each brick. Those were arduous days, sweat mixed with mud, but I felt a warmth in my heart. For the first time in a long time, I no longer felt alone. When the new kiln was completed, it looked even cruder than the old one, but I knew that inside was a solid structure and a heart ready to burn. I prepared for the second firing. This time I was more careful. I chose the best firewood, monitored the fire day and night, adjusting the kiln door to control the airflow. I didn't sleep for the entire 3 days and 3 nights of firing. I sat before the kiln door, feeling the heat on my face, listening to the crackling fire, the sound of the pottery breathing inside. It was not just a technical process. It was a dialogue between me, the fire, and the clay. In the storm of my life, I had found my own fire. Regardless of the outcome of this firing, I knew I was no longer the defeated man on the riverbank. I was a craftsman fighting for the soul of his art, and that fight had only just begun. When the fire in the new kiln finally died down and the temperature had dropped enough to open the door, my heart pounded like a war drum. 3 sleepless days and nights had left my body exhausted, but my mind was unusually alert. This was the moment of truth. I slowly pulled out the brick blocking the kiln door, and a final blast of hot air hit my face. Inside, on a bed of fine ash, were 12 test bowls. I carefully used a long pair of tongs to retrieve them one by one. My hands trembled slightly. The first one, the glaze had run, pooling at the bottom like a puddle of mud. Failure. The second, the glaze was an opaque white, with no translucence. Failure. The 10th, the 11th. All of them were not right. Disappointment began to well up inside me. Perhaps the secret of the lunar white had truly died with the special materials of Jingdezhen. Perhaps my efforts in this remote place were futile. Only the last bowl remained, tucked away in the innermost corner of the kiln, where the temperature was highest and most stable. I took it out and placed it on a wooden board. Its surface was covered in a smooth, ivory-white glaze, but it seemed a bit dull. It looked unremarkable. I sighed, preparing to add it to the pile of rejects. But as I picked it up, the afternoon sun slanted through the doorway and shone upon it, and something magical happened. The glaze was no longer a simple ivory white. It shimmered with a faint blue hue, as clear as an autumn lake. And as I gently turned the bowl, the blue hue seemed to shift and move, sometimes deep, sometimes pale, like moonlight dissolving in water. I froze. Tears suddenly streamed down my face. I had done it. Though it was not perfect, though the blue was still faint, this was it, the soul of the lunar white glaze. I had resurrected it. From the earth and ash of this poor mountain region, in my elation I realized something crucial. The secret of the lunar white was not just in the formula. My ancestors' notes had written, "The glaze is not a dead thing, it is a living entity. It must be nurtured by the tranquility of the soul. The potter must cast aside all distracting thoughts. Let his mind be as clear as water, only then can the glaze crystallize the moonlight." Before, in Jingdezhen, I had everything. The best materials, a modern kiln, fame, and admiration. But my mind was never truly still. I was always haunted by the need to surpass the shadows of my father and grandfather, by the pressure to uphold the reputation of the Lin family. I made pottery with technique and experience, but not entirely with my soul. It was only when I was pushed to the brink, lost everything, and lived in silence and scarcity in Luo Shui that I truly understood those words. The emptiness, the near absolute silence, had purified my soul. I was no longer making pottery to prove anything. I was making pottery because it was my instinct, the only way I could exist, and only then could true art speak. Zhao Ming, with all his cunning and calculation, would never understand this. He could produce thousands of glossy products, but they would forever be soulless shells. Because his soul was filled with the stones of ambition and deceit, he could never create the lunar white glaze. This realization brought me a profound sense of peace. My plan for revenge was no longer about destroying him, but about affirming a truth. True art cannot be faked, cannot be stolen. In the following months, I continued to perfect the glaze formula. With each firing, the blue hue became clearer, the color shift more magical. I discovered that the ash of a type of rhododendron that grew on the mountaintop contained a rare mineral that, when combined with the stream's rock powder, created that wondrous effect. It was a gift from nature to this land, a secret that only someone with enough patience and sincerity could uncover. I didn't just make bowls. I began to create more complex works. A large platter that mimicked the full moon, a tea set where each cup had a different shade of lunar white. My hands were now completely one with the clay. There was no more forcing, no more calculation, only the natural flow of emotion and a technique that had reached maturity. One day, Mr. Zhang came to visit again. He looked at the pieces I had just taken from the kiln and was silent for a long time. His old eyes lit up with astonishment. "I've lived here all my life," he said, his voice full of reverence. "I've seen the streams, the mountains, the moon, but I've never seen anyone who could hold the moonlight in a bowl like this." He picked up a small teacup, turning it in the sunlight. "It has a soul, Master Lin. It's breathing." I smiled. It was the most precious compliment I had ever received. I knew I was ready, not ready for revenge, but ready to tell my story, in the language of ceramics. I didn't need to shout my innocence. I just needed to place my work in the light. The truth, like the lunar white glaze, would shine on its own when the right light was cast upon it, and that light was waiting for me in Shanghai. While I was immersed in the world of clay and fire in Luo Shui, the outside world continued to move. Echoes from the city occasionally reached me, like an undercurrent, reminding me of the reality I had temporarily forgotten. Once, the only young man in the village with a smartphone showed me a trending video. It was an interview with Zhao Ming on a major television channel. He sat there confident and elegant, speaking about the future of traditional ceramics. "We must respect heritage," he said with a virtuous air, "but we cannot be bound by the past. Art must be accessible to the public, not just in the hands of a few wealthy collectors." The mission of the modern Lin family ceramics is to democratize art, bringing the beauty of ceramics into every home. Democratize art. That beautiful phrase was really just another way of saying mass production, devaluing the craft, and turning a legacy into a fast-moving consumer good. I watched as the camera panned across the products on display, placed in luxurious gift boxes, sold on e-commerce platforms with massive advertising campaigns. A dull ache throbbed in my heart. He wasn't just selling ceramics. He was selling out the soul of my ancestors. The young man from the village looked at me, his eyes full of admiration for Zhao Ming. "He's so brilliant, isn't he, uncle? So young and successful." I said nothing, just quietly turned away. How could I explain to him the difference between a successful businessman and a true artist? How could I tell him that the glamour on the screen was just a shadow, while the true soul was hiding in a dilapidated kiln in this very place? The greater Zhao Ming's success, the stronger my determination grew. It was like a catalyst, forcing me to push my art to its absolute limit. I had no more time for doubt or hesitation. One afternoon I received a letter. It had traveled a long way, passing through many hands to reach me. The familiar handwriting on the envelope was immediately recognizable. It was from Old Li, a famous art critic and an old friend of mine. He was one of the few people with the discernment to see the difference between art and artifice. I opened the letter. Old Li didn't ask me about the scandal. He didn't express pity. He only wrote about his concerns for contemporary ceramics. Yong'an, he wrote, I am seeing an alarming emptiness. People are chasing flashy designs, slick brand stories, but they have forgotten the core, the soul of the work. They can create technically perfect products, but they are cold. They lack the warmth of human hands, the heartbeat of the artist. Reading those words, I felt as if a kindred spirit was beside me. He understood. At the end of the letter, he wrote a sentence that made me think. I have always believed that the fire in your kiln never went out. It is just burning somewhere else. If one day you decide to let that fire be seen by the world again, let me know. There are still people waiting to be warmed by it. Old Li's letter was like a gust of wind, fanning the flames within me. I was not alone. There were still people who understood, who cherished true value. But at the same time, practical challenges arose. Winter was approaching. My meager savings were nearly gone. I couldn't live on sweet potatoes and congee forever. To return to Shanghai, I needed money. I faced a difficult choice. I could sell some of the pieces I had made at the county market to make ends meet. The simple brown-glazed bowls and plates, made with all my heart, would surely find buyers. But I didn't. I told myself that my work would only appear in one place, the stage that had once destroyed me. I could not let them be sold trivially in a market corner. That was the last pride of a craftsman. Instead, I took on odd jobs for the villagers. I, Lin Yong'an, once considered a national treasure, now repaired roofs, carried water, and chopped firewood. The hands that once created ceramic masterpieces were now calloused from heavy labor. By day, I was a handyman. By night, when the moon rose, I was an artist again, quietly at my wheel and kiln. The villagers didn't understand why a man who could create such beautiful bowls had to do manual labor, but they respected my choice. Mister. Zhang would sometimes press a little extra money into my hand, saying I worked harder than the young men. Those days were hard, but my soul was at peace. I was living an honest life, free of falsehood. Every coin I earned was soaked in sweat, and it made the hours I spent on my art all the more precious. The echoes from the city, with Zhao Ming's glamour, no longer angered me. They were just distant background noise. My world was now the tranquility of Luo Shui, the warmth of the kiln, the sincerity of the simple villagers. And in that world, a masterpiece was slowly taking shape, nurtured not just by technique, but by humility and dignity forged through hardship. After nearly a year in Luo Shui, I knew it was time to create the decisive work. It would not be a recreation of eternity. Eternity belonged to the past, to a Lin Yong'an of fame and even arrogance. This new work had to belong to the present, to a man who had walked through ruin and found purity in silence. I decided I would not make a large vase or a grand piece. Greatness is not in size. I would make a tea set, a complete set with a teapot, 6 cups, and a serving pitcher. I would name it Silence, because only in silence can one hear the voice of truth. This process demanded absolute concentration. Every detail, from the thickness of the teapot walls, the curve of the spout, to the balance of the cup's rim, had to be perfect. A tea set is not a collection of individual objects. They are a unified whole, a family. They must have harmony, a dialogue with one another. I selected the finest clay I had refined and aged for nearly a year. The clay was ripe, supple, and full of life. I worked mostly at night, when the village was asleep, with only the chirping of insects and the silvery moonlight filtering through the cracks in the door. The teapot was the most difficult. It was the heart of the set. I had to shape it in a single, continuous motion, without any joining, so that the flow of qi and water inside would be uninterrupted. The spout had to have the perfect angle so that when pouring tea, the stream would be round and unbroken, like a small brook. The lid had to fit the mouth of the pot so perfectly that lifting and placing it would not make the slightest sound. I failed 3 times with the teapot. The first 2 times the shape did not achieve the balance I desired. The third time, while finishing the spout, a moment of inattention made my hand tremble slightly, and the entire pot was ruined. I was not discouraged. With each failure, I learned something new. I realized I was still too impatient, still carrying a hint of the desire to prove myself. I spent a few days meditating again, letting my mind return to a state of complete emptiness. And then, on a full moon night, I created the perfect teapot. It rested in my palm, light yet stable. Its form was simple, without any decoration, yet it exuded an elegant and serene beauty. After the teapot, The cups and the serving pitcher came more naturally. They were like children surrounding their mother, each with its own character but all sharing the DNA of harmony. The final and most crucial step was glazing. I used the lunar white glaze I had perfected after dozens of experiments. I did not dip the pieces into the glaze. Instead, I used a fine brush, painting thin layers of glaze onto the ceramic surface by hand. This method allowed me to control the thickness of the glaze at different points, creating more subtle variations in color after firing. When the Silence tea set was ready for the kiln, I looked at it one last time. They were not just utensils for drinking tea. They were the embodiment of the journey I had taken, from ruin to rebirth, from noise to silence, from ashes to moonlight. This firing lasted 4 days and 4 nights. I was practically awake the entire time, only dozing off for a few minutes in front of the kiln. I used the best rhododendron firewood, keeping the flames steady and pure. The temperature in the kiln had to be raised and lowered according to a precise schedule, mimicking the processes of nature. This was no longer technique, it was a ritual. When I opened the kiln, a thin wisp of white smoke emerged, carrying the scent of fired clay and burnt wood. The Silence tea set appeared, resting peacefully on the ashes. They were no longer the color of clay. The entire set was covered in a milky white glaze, as smooth as jade. In the faint light of dawn, they looked ordinary, but I knew their secret was hidden deep inside. I carefully placed them on a wooden table. Then I waited until night fell, and the moon rose high. That night, the moon was brilliantly bright. I brought the tea set out to the yard, placing it on a stone slab. Under the moonlight, a true miracle occurred. The milky white glaze slowly dissolved, giving way to a deep jade-green color, but it was not a static green. It shimmered, moved, as if thousands of stars were hidden within. On the surface of the teapot, thicker glaze lines appeared as a misty mountain range, while the small cups resembled crescent moons reflected on a lake. The entire tea set was like a living ink wash painting, breathing in rhythm with the moonlight. Anyone could copy the shape, but no one could copy this soul, because it was created not just from earth, water, and fire, but also from the silence of a soul that had weathered the storm. This was the shape of truth, a truth that needed no words. The next day, I wrote a short letter to old Li. I didn't tell him about the hardships I had endured. I simply wrote, "Old Li, the fire you spoke of, I think it is warm enough now. If you happen to pass through Qingshan County, please visit Luoshui. There is a new tea set I would like to share with you." I knew he would understand, and I knew my path back to Shanghai had begun. I didn't have to wait long. Just a week after sending the letter, a luxurious black car appeared at the entrance of Luoshui village, causing quite a stir. The villagers gathered curiously, looking at the car as if it were a strange object from another planet. The car door opened, and old Li stepped out. He looked a little older than the last time I saw him, his hair much grayer, but his posture was still erect, and his eyes were as sharp as an eagle's. He wore a simple linen suit and leaned on an ebony cane. He asked a few villagers for directions, and they pointed towards my house at the end of the village. I was waiting for him at the gate. We looked at each other for a long moment without speaking. All the turmoil, all the ups and downs, seemed to be contained in that one look. Finally, old Li patted my shoulder gently. "You've gotten thinner," he said, "but your spirit seems better." "The mountain winds cleanse a man," I replied, a rare smile gracing my lips. I invited him into the house. The hut was simple, empty, with only the most necessary furniture. But old Li paid no attention to the poverty. His eyes were immediately drawn to the Silence tea set, which was placed ceremoniously on the only wooden table. "This is—" He hesitated, stepping closer. I said nothing, just brewed a pot of tea. I used the ancient Snow Mountain tea leaves that Mr. Savana, Zhang, had given me, the best tea in this mountain region. The water was from a high mountain stream, clear and sweet. Every movement I made was slow, deliberate. The sound of the boiling water, the tea being poured into the serving pitcher, then into each cup, were the only sounds in the room. I offered a cup of tea to old Li. He didn't drink it right away. He held the small cup, examining it in the daylight. The glaze was ivory white, smooth. "Beautiful," he said softly. "A humble beauty." We sat drinking tea, making small talk about the weather, about the villagers. I didn't mention the lunar white glaze. I wanted him to discover it for himself. As the sun set and the moon began to rise, I invited him out to the yard. I placed the tea set on the old stone slab. Under the light of the new moon, the magic happened once again. The jade-green color began to emanate from within the glaze, and the stars began to twinkle. Old Li stood motionless. He raised his hand as if to touch it, then drew it back, afraid of shattering the ethereal beauty. He walked around the stone slab, viewing the tea set from every angle. The eyes of a seasoned art critic lit up with astonishment and emotion. "Lunar white," he whispered. "It truly is lunar white. But it's even more alive than what's recorded in the ancient texts. It doesn't just change color. It's telling a story." We sat there, in the silence of the night, with only the moonlight and the tea set for company. A long time later, Old Li finally spoke, his voice filled with emotion. "Yong'an, I was wrong to have doubted you for even a second. This could not have been created by a fraud. It could only have been born from a soul that has been refined to its purest form by fire and water." "Where have you been?" he asked. "What have you been doing this past year?" And so I told him. I told him about Luoshui, about the ruined kiln, the failures, the simple villagers, the secret of the rhododendron ash, and the tranquility of the soul. I didn't speak with the tone of a victim, but of a man who had found his way. Old Li listened without interruption. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "Of course," he said. "It had to be this way. Great art is never born from ease." He looked at me, his gaze firm. "You must go back. You must bring silence to the world." "I will go back," I said. "But how?" "The name Lin Yong'an is now a stain." "Then don't use that name," Old Li said immediately. "Let the work speak for itself. The annual Shanghai art auction is in 2 months. I still have some influence with the organizing committee. I will arrange for silence to be included as a work by an anonymous artist. There will be no name, no biography, only the work. An anonymous artist." The idea was perfect. It stripped away all prejudice, all side stories. It forced everyone to confront the work itself. "But Zhao Ming," I hesitated. "He is very powerful now. He won't let it be." "He won't know," Old Li asserted. "Everything will be kept secret until the last moment. And when silence appears, all his schemes will become meaningless in the face of the beauty of truth. Light will always dispel darkness, Yong'an. You just need to bring the light to the right place." I looked at the tea set bathed in the moonlight. They were so small compared to the vast world out there, compared to Zhao Ming's power and money, but within them lay an extraordinary strength. The strength of authenticity. "I agree," I said, my voice no longer holding any hesitation. The invitation to return had been extended, not by a prestigious organization, but by a true friend and a belief in art. The path back to Shanghai was now open before me. It was not a path of revenge, but a path of vindication. 2 months passed in the blink of an eye. I spent that entire time preparing for the journey, not by packing luggage, but by preparing my spirit. I continued to make pottery, not to create more works, but to keep my hands and mind from being distracted. The tranquility I had painstakingly found in Luoshui, I had to carry it with me into the noisy metropolis. Old Li kept his promise. Everything was arranged discreetly. He sent me a special wooden box, lined with velvet, and designed to keep the silence tea set absolutely safe on the long journey. He also sent some money, not much, but enough for me to cover travel expenses and rent a small room in Shanghai for a few days. In his letter, he simply wrote, "See you in Shanghai. Let art do the rest." The day I left Luoshui, the entire village came to see me off. Mr. Zhang held my hand tightly, his eyes red. "Come back after you're done," he said. "This kiln will be waiting for you." I nodded, my heart full of gratitude. Luoshui had sheltered me in my darkest days, had given me a place to heal and be reborn. This place had become my second home. Returning to Shanghai, I felt a familiar suffocation. The skyscrapers were like giant walls, obscuring the sky. The hurried crowds, the chaotic sounds, were all a stark contrast to the peace of Luoshui. I rented a small room in an old alley, far from the auction center. I didn't want anyone to recognize me. I went to the auction center a day early to deliver the piece. I used the back entrance, as instructed by Old Li. The person in charge of receiving artworks was a young woman. She looked at me, an old man from the countryside in old clothes, then at the wooden box in my hands with a look of skepticism. "The work of the anonymous artist, lot number 079, I said. The young woman checked her list and nodded. She opened the box. When she saw the silence tea set, she froze. The skepticism in her eyes vanished, replaced by astonishment. Even under the electric lights, the tea set couldn't fully display its magical beauty, but the exquisite craftsmanship, the harmony of the set, and the jade-like glaze were enough to captivate anyone with an eye for art. "Please rest assured, sir," the young woman said, her voice now full of respect. "We will take the utmost care of it." After delivering the piece, I felt a sense of relief. My part was done. The rest I entrusted to fate and to the soul of silence itself. The night before the auction, I couldn't sleep. I wandered the streets of Shanghai. The city at night was brilliant with neon lights, glamorous but also lonely. I passed by a large department store, and on the giant LED screen, a commercial for Lin Family Ceramics was playing. It was still Zhao Ming's confident face, still the glossy, soulless products. Looking at it, I no longer felt the anger I once did. Instead, there was a faint sadness. I thought about the thin, shy boy I had brought home from the orphanage 20 years ago. I had taught him how to hold a brush, how to feel the soul of the clay. I gave him a home, a name, a profession. I loved him like my own son. Where did I go wrong? Was it my love and protection that created a person who never learned to appreciate things? Was it my own towering shadow that made him feel suffocated and seek escape at any cost? I was not trying to excuse his actions. That betrayal could not be forgiven. But on this quiet night, I suddenly realized that deep down, he was probably also in pain. The pain of a person who couldn't find his own worth and had to resort to lies and schemes to assert himself. The success he now had probably didn't bring him true peace. It was like his products, beautiful on the outside but empty within. Thinking this, the burden in my heart lightened somewhat. Tomorrow's battle was no longer a confrontation between me and Zhao Ming. It was a confrontation between two worldviews, two philosophies of life, between true art and false commercialism, between enduring value and short-term gain. I returned to my small room as dawn was breaking. I no longer felt anxious or afraid. My heart was as calm as the lake in Luoshui. I had prepared an indigo-colored linen robe, my simplest attire. Tomorrow I would wear it. I would go there not as a man seeking to reclaim his honor, but simply as a potter coming to witness his work speak its own truth. The sun was rising in the east, casting its first rays on the city. The long night was almost over. Whatever the outcome tomorrow, I knew I had already won. I had conquered the hatred and despair in my own heart. And that was the most important victory of all. The auction hall was the same, still luxurious and suffocating. But today, I wasn't standing in the wings. I was sitting in a secluded seat in a corner, a position old Li had arranged. I was an anonymous spectator, a grain of sand in the desert. Zhao Ming was also present. He sat in the front row, the VIP section. He looked dapper, confident, surrounded by influential figures from the business world. He occasionally turned to chat and laugh with them. He didn't notice my presence at all. The auction proceeded with dizzying numbers. Paintings and antiques were sold for millions of dollars. I watched in silence. This world was so alien to me. Finally, the auctioneer announced solemnly, "And now, ladies and gentlemen, a very special piece. Lot number 079. This is the work of an anonymous artist with no biography, no reputation. Our committee has made an exception to include this piece in today's auction for one reason alone: its pure, unadulterated beauty. Please welcome the Silence tea set." The hall fell silent. An anonymous work appearing at such a prestigious event was unheard of. Everyone was curious. Zhao Ming raised an eyebrow, a slight smirk on his face. He probably thought it was just a cheap publicity stunt. An attendant brought the tea set out and placed it on a rotating pedestal. Under the bright stage lights, Silence appeared with its ivory-white glaze, simple to the point of being humble, nothing special. A few whispers of disappointment could be heard. Zhao Ming's lips curled into a sneer. The auctioneer continued. "At the special request of the artist, please join us in experiencing this work under a different light." With that, all the lights in the hall slowly dimmed. The stage grew dark, leaving only a single, soft, silver beam of light shining directly onto the pedestal. Old Li had arranged a special lighting system to simulate moonlight. And then, before hundreds of astonished eyes, the magic began. Against the dark background, the Silence tea set suddenly began to glow. The ivory-white glaze dissolved, giving way to a deep, mystical jade green. Tiny stars began to glitter within the glaze, like a miniature galaxy. The misty mountain range on the teapot emerged, majestic and serene. The small cups were like crescent moons floating on a quiet lake. As the pedestal slowly rotated, the silver light glided over the surface, creating a constant movement, making the entire tea set seem to be breathing, to be alive. The entire hall was plunged into absolute silence, not a single whisper, only breaths held in awe. A soft O of admiration escaped from the most critical of art critics. Everyone was mesmerized by the surreal beauty. I glanced at Zhao Ming. The smile on his face had frozen. His face was pale, his eyes wide with disbelief and shock. He knew, more than anyone, he knew what this was. This was the legendary lunar white glaze, the one he had tried to replicate but failed, the one he thought had vanished forever with me. Lunar white, someone in the front row uttered. The hall erupted. That name, in the world of ceramics, was a myth, and today that myth was coming to life before their very eyes. The auctioneer, his voice also filled with emotion, said, "The starting bid for the Silence tea set is 1 million yuan." Immediately, paddles shot up. 2 million. 5 million. 10 million. The bidding became frantic. No one cared who the artist was anymore. They just wanted to own this one-of-a-kind masterpiece. I paid no attention to the numbers. I only watched Zhao Ming. He sat motionless, his head bowed, his hands covering his face. His world, built on lies, was crumbling. This work, with its undeniable truth, was the most damning verdict. It didn't need me to say a single word. In the end, the tea set was sold for a record-breaking price. The winner was an elderly Japanese collector who stood up and bowed towards the stage as a sign of respect. When the lights in the hall came back on, the auctioneer said, "Ladies and gentlemen, although the artist wishes to remain anonymous, I believe we all want to know who created this masterpiece. With his permission, we are honored to introduce." Old Li, standing in the wings, nodded at me. I slowly stood up and stepped out from the dark corner. I took off the hat that had concealed most of my face. Step by step, I walked towards the stage. The murmurs rose again, but this time with utter astonishment. "It's Lin Yong'an. He's alive." Then the story from last year. All eyes turned to Zhao Ming. He lifted his head and saw me. Our eyes met. In his eyes there was no more confidence or cunning, only emptiness and complete defeat. I stepped onto the stage, no longer looking at him. I took the microphone. I didn't talk about the scandal or the betrayal. I just looked at the audience and spoke slowly. "Thank you. My name is Lin Yong'an, a potter. Silence was not born in Jingdezhen, but in a village called Luoshui. It was made from the earth of the mountains, the water of the streams, and the fire of an old kiln. But most importantly, it was made from silence." I put down the microphone and bowed to the audience. I had reclaimed everything, not by demanding it back, but by creating. The honor of the Lin family was not in the accolades or the sky-high prices. It was in the work itself, in the unquenchable fire of the artist. As I turned and walked into the wings, I knew that from now on my kiln would never be of cold ashes again. It would continue to burn, not just in Jingdezhen, but wherever there was earth, water, and an artist's soul that never surrendered. When I stepped backstage, old Li was already waiting. He said nothing, just took my elbow, a steady grip that grounded me amidst the storm swirling around us. Behind me, the hall was still in an uproar. Applause, calls of my name, the jostling of reporters at the exit. It all created a chaotic sound I hadn't heard in a year. "Let's go," old Li said softly. "This place is no longer for us." He led me through an emergency exit, away from the fervent crowd. We emerged into a small alley behind the auction center, the cold, damp Shanghai night air hitting my face. The sudden silence after the noise made my ears ring. I took a deep breath, trying to regain my rhythm. "You did it," old Li said, his voice still trembling with emotion. "You let the ceramics speak for themselves." "I only did what a potter must do," I replied, looking up at the sliver of a crescent moon hanging between the tall buildings. I returned the soul to the clay. We were about to hail a taxi when a figure stumbled out of the shadows, blocking our path. It was Zhao Ming. He looked pathetic. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, his slicked hair now a disheveled mess. His face no longer held its smugness, only shock and desperation. He was drunk, the heavy smell of alcohol radiating from him. "Father," he called out, his voice hoarse. Old Li stood in front of me, his ebony cane held firmly in his hand like a weapon. "What more do you want? Haven't you done enough?" Zhao Ming paid no attention to old Li. He just stared at me, his eyes red and welling with tears. "Why?" he mumbled. "Why did you come back? Why didn't you just die in some forgotten corner? You could have left me in peace." Those words, though venomous, no longer had the power to wound me. Now, they sounded like the whimpers of a defeated man. "I never left, Zhao Ming," I said, my voice calm. I was always in every piece of clay, every flame of the Lin family kiln. It was you who left. I did everything, he screamed, his voice breaking. I took the Lin family to new heights. I turned it into an empire. And you? All you knew was how to cling to old, outdated things. All you knew was your lunar white glaze. Do you even know what people out there want? I do, I interrupted him. They want authenticity, and that is the one thing you do not have. My words were like a final blow, piercing his armor of arrogance. Zhao Ming collapsed to his knees, sobbing like a child. His cries echoed in the empty alley, desolate and lonely. He wasn't crying out of remorse. He was crying for his failure, for the collapse of the illusion he had built for himself. I looked at him, the son I had raised, now kneeling at my feet in the dust of his own lies. I felt no satisfaction. I only felt a profound sadness, a tragedy not just for me, but for him as well. Let's go, Yong'an, old Li urged. It's over. I nodded and turned to leave. I didn't look back. Zhao Ming's cries faded behind me, merging with the noise of the city. That was the last sound I heard from him. The sound of a world turning to dust. We didn't go back to my small room. Old Li took me to a small tea house that was open all night. We sat in a quiet corner, with only the sound of water trickling from a rockery and the faint scent of incense. The press will go crazy tomorrow morning, Old Li said, after pouring me a cup of tea. Your phone won't stop ringing. Collectors, museums, they will all come looking for you. I don't need those things, I said, sipping the tea. It was pleasantly bitter at first, then a sweet aftertaste spread through my throat. I just need my kiln. Your workshop will be returned to you. All charges will be dropped. Zhao Ming will face the law for slander and commercial fraud, Old Li said. Justice will be served. Justice. The word sounded so distant. To me, justice wasn't in a courtroom or a verdict. Justice was in the silence tea set itself. It had judged everything in its own language. I will return to Jingdezhen, I said. But after that, I will go back to Luo Shui. Old Li looked at me, surprised. You're not planning to stay in Jingdezhen? That's where you belong. A part of me belongs to Jingdezhen, I replied. But another part, the purest and most tranquil part, now belongs to Luo Shui. I cannot lose it again. I will travel between the two places. Jingdezhen is where I will preserve my heritage, but Luo Shui is where I will preserve my soul. Old Li nodded, a smile of understanding on his face. A great artist doesn't belong to any one place. You belong to your art. We sat there, drinking tea until dawn. For the first time in a year, I saw the Shanghai sunrise without feeling despair. I knew that no matter how noisy and chaotic the world outside was, as long as I had Luo Shui in my heart, as long as my kiln had its fire, I would never be lost. The train ride back to Jingdezhen this time was completely different. No longer a fugitive fleeing in defeat, I returned as a man who had found himself. The news from Shanghai had preceded me. When I stepped onto the platform, there were no more scrutinizing gazes or whispers. Instead, there were joyful faces and respectful nods. Uncle Zhang, the old potter, was already waiting, his eyes glistening. I knew it, he said, his voice trembling. I knew you were innocent. The familiar cobblestone path seemed happier. Neighbors came out to greet me. Other potters invited me for a cup of tea. This warm welcome warmed my heart, but also felt a little distant. I had grown accustomed to silence. This noise, however well-intentioned, was a bit tiring. When I reached my little alley, another scene awaited me. The seal on the workshop door had been removed. The crimson wood door was wide open. Standing in front were a few staff members from the Ceramics Association and the local government. They had come to formally return my property and offer an apology. I just nodded in acceptance, not saying much. The thing I wanted most right now was to be alone in my own home. After everyone had left, I crossed the threshold. 1 year. It had only been a year, but it felt like a century. Everything inside was covered in a thick layer of dust. The smell of dampness and the cold of an abandoned place filled my nostrils. The potter's wheel sat silently in a corner, covered in cobwebs. Unfinished ceramic pieces sat on the shelves, dried and cracked. The kiln was silent, cold. This place had once been my entire world. Now, it was just an empty shell, a monument to a past collapse. I didn't start cleaning right away. I just walked around quietly, touching the familiar objects. Every scratch on the wooden table, every crack in the brick wall, was a piece of memory. I went into Zhao Ming's room. His things were still there. Books, clothes, and even the ceramic designs he had drawn. The early designs, from when he was a boy, were full of innocence and creativity. Then, gradually, The later drawings became more complex, more glamorous, but had lost that initial spirit. I could see his entire transformation through these sketches. A wave of sadness washed over me. I decided to start my work from the most important place, the kiln. I needed to relight the fire for this place. I spent a whole week cleaning and repairing the kiln. This time, I didn't just repair it. I renovated it, applying the experience I had gained from building the kiln in Luoshui. I wanted it to be not just a Lin family kiln, but a Lin Yong'an kiln. One afternoon, as I was plastering the refractory clay inside the kiln, a figure appeared at the door. I looked up. It was Zhao Ming. He looked haggard. No more fancy suits, just a faded shirt and jeans. His face was unshaven, his hair a mess. He had been released on a huge bail. His company had collapsed, contracts were canceled, partners had turned their backs on him. He had lost everything, just like I had a year ago. He stood there, at the threshold, not daring to step in. His eyes looked at me, then at the kiln, a complex expression of shame, guilt, and perhaps a hint of resentment. I said nothing. I continued my work. My hands smoothly applied the clay. Silence enveloped us. Only the scraping sound of the trowel on the kiln wall could be heard. A long time later, he finally spoke, his voice hoarse and weak. I just wanted to come and see. See what? I asked, still not looking at him. To see if I was dead? Number, he whispered. I don't know. He stood there a while longer. My silence seemed heavier than any rebuke. Finally, he turned and shuffled away. I could have called him back. I could have cursed him, demanded an explanation, an apology, but I didn't. I realized that the greatest punishment for him was not my hatred but my silence. That silence told him that, to me now, he was no longer important. The bond between us, whether as father and son, or master and apprentice, had been severed by his own hand. Reconciliation, if possible, could not come from me. It had to come from him, from true remorse, a rebirth from the ashes of his own life. That path, he had to walk alone, just as I had. I continued my work. My hands did not tremble. The new layer of clay covered the old kiln walls, hiding the cracks of the past. My kiln was almost ready to be fired up again. And this time, the flame would be purer and stronger than ever before. The kiln in Jingdezhen was ready, but I was in no hurry to light the fire. I knew there was something I needed to do first. I returned to Luoshui. I didn't bring many things with me, just a few pottery tools and my ancestors' notebooks. The house in Jingdezhen, though cleaned, still felt empty. It was a legacy, a responsibility, but the earthen hut in Luoshui, to me, was truly home. It was where my soul belonged. Mr. Zhang and the villagers welcomed me back like family. Life here was the same, simple and genuine. I fixed up the old kiln, not to create masterpieces, but to make ordinary items for the villagers. Rice bowls, water jars, vases for wildflowers. I didn't sell them, I gave them as gifts. Whenever a child in the village came to watch me work, I didn't shoo them away. I gave them a small lump of clay, showed them how to roll it into a ball, how to press it to form a bowl. Watching the clumsy but eager hands of the children shaping the clay, I felt a simple joy. Perhaps this was the most natural way for a legacy to be passed on, not through profound lessons, but through the joy of creation. One day, I received a letter forwarded from Jingdezhen. The handwriting was shaky, clumsy. It was from Zhao Ming. The letter was sent from a prison. He had been sentenced to 3 years for fraud. I opened the letter, my heart calm. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just wrote about his experiences. He wrote about the sleepless nights in prison, about the emptiness when he was no longer surrounded by money and fame. He wrote that in the silence of the 4 walls, for the first time, he heard his own voice, and he realized that he had been chasing a shadow for so many years. What I was truly jealous of, he wrote, was not your talent, but your peace when you sat before the potter's wheel. That is something I couldn't buy with all the money in the world. I was wrong, Father. I don't expect you to forgive me. I only hope that after I get out I can start over. Not as the heir of the Lin family, but just as Zhao Ming, a craftsman. I finished reading and folded the letter. A single tear rolled down my cheek. Not a tear of forgiveness, but one of sorrow for a path that had gone too far astray, and a fragile hope for a path yet to come. Perhaps prison was his Luoshui. I decided to return to Jingdezhen. It was time to light the first fire. I didn't make any elaborate pieces. I placed a single teapot in the kiln. A simple teapot, made from Jingdezhen clay, but shaped with the technique and soul of Luoshui. I didn't use the lunar white glaze. I left it unglazed. I wanted it to have the most authentic beauty of Earth after being tempered by fire. I lit the fire. The small flame flickered at first, then gradually grew, roaring joyfully in the kiln. I sat there for a whole day and night, tending the fire. I didn't think about the past, nor did I worry about the future. I focused only on the fire before me. The fire was purifying the kiln, purifying the house, and purifying my soul. The next morning, when I opened the kiln, the teapot emerged, its fired clay a deep red, like a warm heart. Its surface was not glossy, but it had a strange warmth. I poured water into it and brewed a pot of tea. The stream of water flowed from the spout, round and strong. The fragrance of the tea filled the room. I sat alone, in my ancestors' workshop, sipping tea from the first teapot of a new life. I didn't know what the future would hold. Would Zhao Ming truly change? Would I find someone to pass on my legacy to? I didn't know. But that no longer mattered. I looked at the fire still flickering in the kiln. It was not a fire of glory or revenge. It was a fire of life. A humble, enduring, and pure fire. And I knew, as long as that fire burned, the Lin family kiln would never truly be of cold ashes. It would continue to tell its story, a story of earth, of fire, and of a soul that had found peace in the embers.